Right. This is divine, sorry, not divine phase. It's definitely not a divine phase two. It's more like a design phase two, part six. This is where I attempt to take dye and create the look of an Ireland flag with the name of Ireland on the surface, what I call the pouch face that goes onto the back pocket of this item I'm working on. Now, I should say I really appreciate all these experts doing all their work and showing these videos. Problem is that it's almost like these guys' projects are blessed by an angel or something. Nothing ever seems to go wrong. So when you're doing something, you're trying to do exactly what they did, and guess what? Your ink, your dye starts running into the resolene, the acrylic finisher that you put down. What do? And it just seems like you cannot find a video where they show you how to correct something like that. So you'll find this video, it happens over and over and over again. I mean, try as I might, I could not get the dye or the ink to keep from spreading into the resolene on my project. So I'm definitely not touched by an angel. I'm more like touched by Murphy's Law or something. I've been paying taxes to it my whole life. So I show you how to deal with that issue. So if you ever have to put resolene coating onto a project where you're using dye, and it starts to, the dye or the ink starts to run into the resolene, this is how I think you can fix it without having to scrap the whole project. One more point I wanted to make. There's a section of the video where I use Q-tips with ethanol on it to correct areas of the lines. I do that on the white section only. Do not put a Q-tip with ethanol on it in the areas where there's dye that's green or orange, or any color for that matter. Because what can happen is it can pull up the dye and leave white spots. You're better off just taking a Q-tip and drawing up the resolene that's contaminated with ink or dye and just trying to redo it with dye or ink over again, or just put another coat on it after it dries. Do not put ethanol into those areas where there's orange or green or another dye color, because the ethanol is likely to screw up the color, and then you end up having to toss the whole project. And you really don't want to do that. So just a reminder. So here we go. Have fun watching all my mistakes and blunders, and yeah, it's great times. Great times. For this video, I'm going to show you how to take a piece of leather, basically what I call pocket face. It's going to be the little pocket, the face of the back pocket for this right here. This is the one I ended up using. I did this one at the same time I did this one right here. Problem is that my battery died in the middle of it and I didn't realize it, so I'm sitting there doing all this stuff and didn't record any of it. So I don't have the video for me doing this one and this one. So I had to redo the video, and then I encountered some problems when I was doing it. So basically, altogether, I've done, as you can see, 10 of these to try and get a sense of the process and work out the best solution for it. Okay, so these two right here were my first test pieces, right here. This was me just taking a piece, making it, and then putting the dye down and just to see what would happen if I used ink. So part of this I used dye marker, part of this I used ink, and then I got it wet, that's why it's all warped and everything, just to see what would happen. I wanted to know if it would run. And I didn't even get to the point because it was coming right off on my fingers. So this one was my first attempt. I went ahead and just did one from scratch. I didn't do more than one, just the one, just to see what would happen. And I put the dye down without any resolene or anything, and this is what happened. The dye penetrated the leather and then spread out beyond the lines. And that's when I determined I really need to put a coat of resolene down first to prevent that from happening. So that led me to, well, this one's actually here. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of all these. I did. So that led me to doing these two right here. And I did these with, actually, it's not in the current video because I lost the footage, but I used an ultra-fine Sharpie to do these, the lines and the lettering, and it actually turned out really well. The problem is that I used 10 of them to do it. It took 10 of those ultra-fine Sharpie markers to do it, and it did the exact same thing that the dye markers were doing. The ink would come up when I put the resolene down, which was a problem. That's the one thing you don't want it to do. You don't want this ink to pop up in the middle of your project. At this point, I'm convinced you can't avoid it. There's no way to keep this ink in the lettering and all that from coming up when you put resolene down, so you just have to work around it. But this is the one I ended up using, and this was the other one that's actually usable. It's a nice, clean example of it. So, I had to redo the video, and in redoing the video, I actually screwed up. I did this one first. I am shifting these all around because I can't keep track. Problem is I had them all in the right order, and then I realized they were turned towards me and not towards the camera. So I flipped them all around and flipped them around in the wrong order. So this one I made for the video, but I used leather that was too thin, and it actually cut through it. So that's unusable, not because the lettering isn't crisp and clean. Ultrafine point Sharpie on this one too, which turned out actually quite well. You just have to use a ton of them to do it. You'll go through 2 packages of them just to do a simple lettering, which is kind of a waste. $10 in markers just to do it. So that one's a toss. This one I got lazy on, and I made just using dye markers, and as you can see, the dye was all over the place. I couldn't salvage it because it was so bad. I did that at the same time I did these 3 right here, all 3 of these at once. And this one, the dye marker just kept coming off and all that. By the time I got around to it, it was too late. I couldn't salvage it. This one was okay up until I tried to redo the green, and I spilled some water all over it. And I didn't realize it. By the time I went to look at it, it was ruined. So that's kind of what happens when you're doing this. When you're trying to get your process refined, is you run into a bunch of throwaways. This one was my only example of using paint. And I have to be honest, I don't like using paint on leather. It just makes it look like plastic, because you can't see through the paint. You can't see the natural grain of the leather like you can on this one. You can see the difference. You can see the natural grain. It looks like leather. That looks like PU. Well, you know, that fake leather. It just doesn't look very good. So these were the last 2 that I did, and this is what the video is actually showing, the process for doing these. It took 6 coats of resolene to get this effect. I'm sorry, I wish I could have found a better process to do it. You might want to try the ultrafine point Sharpies. It seems to do a better job if you want it really nice and crisp like this. But the Signo pen works fine too. It just puts down a little bit too much ink is the problem. These are both, well, this one's usable. The problem with this, I screwed up the A. I got too close to the line. That's not actually usable. This one, the A is really close to the line, but I would consider this usable, personally. So there you have it. 10 examples of it, and they all have their issues. So I'm going to now do the full video showing the process, and at this point you can use an ultra-fine point Sharpie. You can use, let's see if I have one here. I had to toss a bunch of them. You can use, this is an ultra fine point Sharpie. You can use a Uniball Signo pen, or you can use a dye marker. But if I were to make a suggestion, I would say use the Uniball 207 Plus pen, just because with one of these, you get enough ink to do whatever you need. This, you'll go through like a package or two of them just to be able to do the name a couple of times. And I would suggest doing at least 2 at the same time until you get to the process where you're doing the lettering. The mistake I made when I did the lettering is that I didn't do the resolene coat one at a time. You want to do a coat of resolene and then try to clean up the resolene and all that on one piece at a time, and then do it on your backup piece separately, so that you're not trying to clean up 2 of these at the same time. So there you have it. Now I will direct you to the video. And I'm going to coat this with resolene using a spray bottle. Get a nice strong coat on it. You can feel it and see if it's wet, and it does appear to be nice and wet, so yeah, nice and wet. Flip it over and then put some resolene on the front. The spray bottle's not working as well as I would like here. Get it nice and thick. There we go. Try to keep the bubbles off of it, like so. Okay. So what I'll do now is I'll let it dry, and what this does is it creates a protective coating that keeps the dye from penetrating all the way into the leather and then spreading outwards. Okay, this coat of resolene is now dry. And you can see the problem is these letters are a little bit shallow. Thinking I might have to give them another whack. And unfortunately, when you do this, you run the risk of double stamping on them. Looks like the I is fine on both sides. The R needs some work. The E definitely the A. This N, that D. The L is the only one that's passable at this point, but I might as well do it as well. So the I is the only one that looks like it doesn't need to be redone at this point. And you got to be really careful when you re-stamp something like this, that you don't end up ruining it. So we'll start with the R. Get my hammer. Need some light. Okay. Now the way I normally do this when I re-stamp is I try to put it in the same spot and feel it. When it's this shallow though, it's kind of tricky to do. There, I think that's right. Yeah, that one turned out okay. This one's shallow enough that I may not be able to get it in there just right. It's going to be a tough one. There we go. It turned out okay. So now we got the E. Make sure you got the mark right. This one right here is pretty dang shallow. Right there, it looks like. Be really careful. I double stamp just a little bit, just slightly, but it's hardly noticeable. Okay. Now our L. This one is a little bit more pronounced than the others, other than the I itself. Okay. I'm just redefining the letters, try and get them a little bit better. That one I double stamped a little bit. You can see I'm off now, fortunately. Okay. Not perfect, but it's really hard to do it perfect. You'll see there that I did double stamp a little bit on the N and the D. So you can take a marking pencil and go in there and just smooth it out a little bit, like so. Just make the top portion a little bit larger, like so. And then when you actually put the die down, it won't be that noticeable. So now I'm ready to do the next step, and that is to literally coat the two colors of dye right here. Now I should warn you, the experts I've seen doing this kind of stuff are amazing, and I really don't know how much time or effort they spend learning how to do it, but I have found it's a little bit tricky trying to keep different colors of dye from blending and acting in unpredictable ways. So for me, it's a bit of a challenge. So if it's a challenge for me, then I'm sure it's a challenge for somebody else as well. Okay, so I've got a saddle tan right here. Got my green right here. I'm going to take my brush. I do have dye markers, but I actually prefer just to use a paintbrush when I'm doing this kind of work. So this side is going to be saddle tan. You can see the line there. And as I said before, one of the reasons why I use resolene first is to control the color. Try to get it to look as uniformly as you can. There's an artifact there for some reason. That happens sometimes, where you get a little bit of variation on the leather, and there's not much you can do about it. So now I'm going to take my paintbrush and do the edge. It's not really important to do this since you're going to be doing black as well on the edge, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you see and it's a little dark on the edge anyway because of the, I'm going to do the bottom, like so. Fortunately, sometimes you just end up with artifacts on the on your surface that you can't really do anything about. So you either have to decide whether or not you want to do it over again or just continue. Like here, I've got a little black spot right there on the bottom of that for some reason. So I've got to look at it and say, hey, do I want to continue or do I want to just start over again? And in this case, for me, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to go ahead and just continue. I'll say it again, it's a real challenge trying to get a uniformity of color with this stuff. And you can see it with this one. Around the lettering, it's a little bit darker than it is on the rest of it. So you can try to fix it by going and doing this, but there's no guarantees you're going to end up fixing the problem. That does look a little better right there. Same thing here. It's a little darker along the letters, so I'm going to try to do a second coat around the letters, like so. And that line's not straight right there. It's a little off. So, there we go. Do the bottom. On the sides. Okay. Now I got the orange in place. Clean my brush. Although it's not as big of a deal when you're using a darker color, it's still a good idea. But if you're using a darker color to a lighter, always clean your brush. And always do more than one of these. Because the last thing you want is to do all this work and then have one of them, the one that you're working on, end up looking like crap. So the next thing I'm going to do is flip these around, and I'm going to do the green now. Right here. Try to be really careful doing this the right way the first time, because this green here in particular is too dark to do a second coat. If you have to do a second coat, it's ruined. Sorry to say. I should have gotten a lighter green for this, but I didn't know it was going to be so dark. Okay, that one turned out pretty good. Now I'm going to do the edge. The other reason for doing the edge is it gives you an idea of where the lines are going to be on the back. Okay, got a little bit of a carryover. Just clear that up before you move on. Otherwise you're liable to end up with what looks like a stained mark on it. Okay, my line is right here. What happened there? Green looks kind of weird. Sometimes your coat of resolene is just not strong. It wasn't done well enough, and you'll get a really, really dark back side. As long as it doesn't bleed through, you're okay though. So that's my first part. I've dyed the compartments, okay? The next part involves, well, I'm going to finish this one first, and then I'll go over the next part. Okay? There we go. Trying to do this as uniformly as I can so that it looks nice and good. And there's one way to do this, where you do a nice strong coating and just do what I did, or you can take a paper towel and just sort of touch it, and sometimes that'll help. Like so. It'll help with the darker areas sometimes. Now I'm going to do the edges. These edges are going to be done in black as well, but it's good to do the edges so you know where the line is on the back. Since I didn't really mark the line on the back, this tells me where that line is going to be. Just like so. Oop, I dropped my brush. A dye sticks to resolene pretty well, better than most things, but you really have to let it dry. If it doesn't dry, then you're going to run into the risk of it leaking and screwing up your project. So there we have it. Both of my flags are done, and when the color dries, it'll look a little bit more uniform. So now what I need to do is let it dry overnight, just to make sure that this dye is just to make sure this dye is completely dry. I let it dry overnight. So the next step in this process, the nice thing about doing dye is, like I said before, you can see through the dye and get some sense of the grain of the leather. You can literally see like the patina of the leather through the dye, and it helps to preserve that leather look, which you just can't get when you're doing paint. So the next step in this process is to actually put these letters darker, to make them darker so you can actually see them, because the way they are now you can't really see the name of the island on here. So there's two approaches here. You can use a dye marker. This one's made by Molotow. It is about the thinnest one I could find. It's a 1 millimeter extra fine. As you can see from right there, it says 1 millimeter extra fine. And you'll see even a 1 millimeter extra fine is a little bit big to do the letters with, but I'm going to do it anyway just to show you. Because if you can do something with dye, it's almost always better than doing something else. So I'll do the top one, the one that I didn't use a jig on. You can see the letters kind of move upwards. It's not the best in dye markers. And then I'm going to do the other one I used a jig on, and I'm going to use an actual pen. This Uniball 207 Plus has a real nice fine point, and it has a super ink that's supposed to be water resistant. So we're going to find out exactly how water resistant this thing really is. Okay? So there we have it. I am now going to mark in the name. So I can get a little bit better view here. There we go. It's going to be tricky because these letters are 1/4 inch. They're fairly small. So I'm going to start right off here. This is using dye, as I've said. Just work it in. The dye fills up the little felt tip, and then that felt tip sort of drops the dye in. You got to be really careful here because it wants to go outside the line. As you can see, it already has to some degree gone outside the line a little bit. So there's your I. Next thing we're going to do is the R. This is supposed to be an extra fine point, but it's having a real hard time keeping the dye confined to the shape of the letter. And I've looked, and I have not been able to find a way to do this. Well, I should say I haven't been able to find a dye marker that's smaller than this. You have to be really careful. One little slip and you're done. This dye will not come off. Not without ethyl alcohol or something. And, you know, the problem with alcohol, it just doesn't look as good. So you're going to go outside the line no matter how you cut it. There's no way around it when you're using a dye marker.
no matter how careful you are, it's going to look a little bit bigger than the actual letter, as you can see. Unfortunate. But the advantage of the dye is that it will stick. It will resist the resolene a lot better, or it should. It's not always the case. I've had mixed results even with dye and resolene. Takes a little bit of practice to do this. You may find you're going to end up going through a whole bunch of these to start until you get this process down. See that? The lettering is fairly large compared to what you want. I can't say I like that part of it, but there's just no way around it. This point is the finest one I could find. They don't have a finer one that I know of. Maybe there is one, I just haven't found it. Okay, there's the L. Gotta be really careful here. There's the A. And I got 2 more letters left. Woohoo! Jeez. Yep, that went out of lines a little bit. Okay. So there you have it. That is the lettering using dye markers. Let me show you here. A nice bold lettering. Now this you have to let dry completely. You cannot put resolene on this if it's wet, even the slightest bit. So wait 24 hours if you have to. Make absolutely sure this is completely dry before you do anything with it. So that's the first one. That's with the dye marker. Now I'm going to show you how to do it with just a regular pen. This is using a Uniball 207 Plus. You're going to see the difference here. It's actually fairly noticeable. This little micro point that you get with the pen is actually really nice. You have a lot of control. You can keep it within the lines a lot easier. The challenge you face when doing ink from a pen, even something with what they call super ink, that's what this is supposed to have, some kind of a super ink is that the resolene will have a tendency to dissolve it. It's going to want to dissolve it. There's the I and the R. It'll be more noticeable when I'm doing the letters on the white, and the accuracy you can get with just a regular pen. Really makes a difference having this micro point. Oop. Not wanting to do that little part right there. Okay. My hand's shaking a little bit because it's kind of cold outside right now. My fingers are feeling it. The nice thing about having a stamped letter is the ink wants to settle into the little valley that's formed by the stamped letter, which is nice. Try to keep it in the valley though, and I just got out of it a little bit there. It's going to make the L a little bit bigger than I want. The thing about ink and dye, they like to spread out. Okay, I-R-E-L-A. You know, it's funny, I've actually misspelled something before, which is unusual for me because I'm really good with words. But talk about frustrating. You get all this work done and you realize, hey, that is misspelled. It really sucks. There's the A. Remember, I double stamped the N and the D, so now we're going to see the result of that. Let's see if we can fix it with the dye. See how noticeable it is with once you put the dye down. Okay. See there, it's nice for hiding mistakes. Now we're going to do the D. Same thing. Fill in this, try to cover up that mistake I made with the double stamp. Amateurs, such as myself, you can't help but make mistakes. You just have to decide if you can live with them or not. If you can't live with them, then start over again. Don't give up. I have to make this D a little bit bigger than I want because of the fact that I double stamped it. So there you have it. That is done with pen. Looks very similar to the die. The big difference is you have a lot more control with that pen, and it's not as... So there you have it. We have two pieces now. This one here was done with dye. This one here was done with pen. I'm literally going to wait 24 hours for this ink and dye to completely dry before I even consider putting a protective coat over it. Okay? This dye is not completely dry, but it is dry enough to do these lines. So I'm going to just use a simple popsicle stick to do these lines. Like so. I'm going to take, this is the one I did with marker. I'm going to take my popsicle stick, just set it right on that line. Let's do it from this side so you can see it. Set it right on that line. Like so. And I'm going to take the die marker and just mark right along that line. Very carefully. Like so. Makes a good, crisp, clean line. Okay? These popsicle sticks are so cheap. I don't like to waste my ruler when I do that, because it gets dye on there, and then it's, sometimes it comes off. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to take my marker. I'm going to position it right there. See if you can see it. Yeah. Right along that orange. And I'm going to make another line right there on that orange to cover the orange and the white, because it's not perfect. A nice crisp line, like so. Okay. So that line's done. Pull that aside. Do the same thing on this one. I'm not going to use pen this time. This time I'm just going to use dye on this. Let's get this so you can see it. Same thing there. I'm just going to run right along that green. Really close to the R there. Okay. Make a nice crisp line. Same thing on the orange. Went out of the line a little bit on this orange, so I got to do it a little bit closer this time in order to hide that. That's the other advantage of the line. I got to be careful I don't go too close, because that A is really close to this line. I don't want to pull the A in. I'm going to have to pull out a little bit right there, like so. Sometimes you have to kind of get your ink flowing a little bit, so I'm actually pushing on something, trying to get the ink to come out, because it doesn't want to come out right now. Okay, or the dye, I mean, not the ink. Really close to that A. Oh, that didn't make as nice of an edge as I wanted to. It's not as dark as I was hoping, so I'm going to have to redo it. There we go. That A got really close to that line. So now I've got both of these done. I'm going to give a little bit of time to dry so that I don't accidentally touch those lines and screw them up. So at this point I've done the lines to separate the flag compartments, and I have dyed and inked in the lettering for these two pieces. This one was dye, this one was ink. You can still, this dye is still a little bit wet, or the ink is almost completely dry. So I'll let them dry a little bit, come back, and then I'll do the edge, and then I'll let them dry overnight to finish it up. And I'm literally just going to do the edge. These edges were beveled. Not only were they beveled, but they were also burnished. So you should have a nice, relatively smooth edge here to work with. Okay, got the sides there. Now I'm going to do a little bit of the edge into the pattern here, because I kind of like it to overlap a little bit, just like so. It's becoming a little bit frayed, so this Q-tip's done. Time to move on to the next one. Okay. I'm going to do this edge now, where the white is. Do the other side. Same thing here, I'm going to do a little bit of the overlap on this edge. Try to keep it nice and straight as much as possible, so you don't end up with the dye overwhelming the edge. There we go. And that Q-tip shot. Okay, we've got now just to overlap on this one. I don't mind if it's perfect. I don't mind a little bit of a roughness to it myself. Some people are perfectionists. I don't think it's a bad thing to be, but you know, you can really stress yourself out by trying to make it too perfect. I did that one a little bit badly, so I'm going to have to mark it a little bit more. And if I do that one side, I'm going to have to do this side here too. Okay. Okay. I like a little bit bolder line actually anyway. Same on this side. Problem with these Q-tips is they get a little bit frayed and they start to stick out. And if you're not careful, you can end up with these lines in the side of your project. There we go. So this one is done. It's ready to be just let drying now. So that'll literally dry overnight. I don't want to take any chances that that dye is not dry when I get around to working on it. Okay, I'm going to do this one now, do the edge. Like so. Do a nice strong border. Okay, toss that one. That's shot. Okay. Like so. Q-tip gives you a lot of control. Actually, surprisingly more than you might think. Okay. Now I just got that little bit on the white left to do. Like so. Now the one thing you want to do here, when you've done this, you want to make sure that there's a good line on the back side. So grip it carefully And make sure that you get a fair amount on this edge here. And the reason for that is simple. You don't want your threading to show, you want it to be black where your threading is going to be. You want this part right where your threading is going to go to be black. It'll be really hard to do it after the fact. It doesn't have to be perfect because you're not going to see it. But darken all the area where you're... Now the one area where it's going to matter is right here. The reason why is because this part you'll see. So you want to make this line as straight as you can get it. Like so. So now we've gotten that part done. Do the same thing on the other side here. You're going to darken all of the area where your stitching is going to be. Because part of this will show, and you want it to be dark so it doesn't look odd. And this line here, you'll want to be as straight as you can get it. Like so. I missed a spot over here, right on this edge. And there you have it. Now what I'll do is I'll let these dry overnight, literally for 24 hours. And then I'll come back and lay a coat of resolene on them. And that's when you'll find out if you screwed up or not. I hate to say it, but it's really easy to foul up. Okay, so this is the moment of truth here. This one here was done with dye. This one here was done with ink. And the ink is a little more glossy. It's supposed to be a super ink, meaning it's waterproof. Dye is the same thing. It's supposed to be waterproof as well. Problem with resolene, which is also one of the advantages of resolene, so I should call it the advantages and disadvantages of resolene. Resolene is supposed to be sort of like a almost stain-proof material, meaning that stuff doesn't stick to it. And that is where the challenge comes when you're trying to control dye. Is that even dye and inks don't necessarily want to stick to resolene. So it's great for controlling it, but you still need it to stick to it to some extent. So we're going to actually test it out. This is a slightly damp paper towel. I'm going to set it on there and see if it pulls up anything. This is just water. If water will cause this to come up, then the resolene will as well. So we're going to set it on there and just push it down. Like so. Pull it up, and you can see there, the green comes up. So does the lettering. That's not good. You don't want anything to come up. For whatever reason, the orange didn't come up. Neither did the lines, which is good. But the lettering and this green did. So it may be that the green was put on a little bit too thickly. So now we're going to try the other one, the one that we use just dye, and see how that one matches up. Set it on there, push down, like so, and then pull it up and see. Same problem, your green is coming off of there. And even the lettering is slightly coming up as well. So there's a very good chance now that this is going to come up a little bit when you lay down your resolene. But at least it's not coming up in big gobs. If that were the case, you'd be doomed. You'd have to start over. or you'd have to be really careful how you approach this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take and put resolene on this. I'm going to use the same approach. This time I'm going to take a paper towel that's soaked in resolene. And I'm going to try to set it on there and see if I can put a light, thin coat of resolene down onto it. That's what I'm trying to do here. To put a nice light coat on there. So I'm putting this paper towel into the resolene, and then I'm going to squish it out like so. So I don't use up a bunch of it just for this thing. Enough on there that I can put down a coat of it without interfering with it too much. If you drench it in resolene, you're gonna have a hard time with it. And then I'm gonna just let it sit on there. Just put it down on, and just try to apply a light coat of resolene on there. Have another paper towel handy in case it picks up a little bit, so you can dab it like so. Be careful when you're dabbing it, like I didn't right there. So we'll try the other one. There we go. If you have to, take some Q-tips. Wow, that dye is just coming right off of there. See that? So if I had put resolene on there, I would have ended up with a problem. So, dab down onto it, like so. Try to keep that resolene from darkening on the letters, like this one. And so far, it's not doing well, to be perfectly honest with you. Oddly enough, the ink has done a better job than the other. So I'm going to have to fix it before it dries too much. So I'm going to take a little bit of ethyl alcohol here, and I'm just going to try to clean up this black stains right here. Just a light touch here, just like so. Okay, a little bit more. Just like so. Now I'm going to have to clean up the line. You spend all this time doing this, you don't want to start over again. Take my word for it. So right now we're just trying to get a nice light coat of resolene on there to provide some kind of cover for it. So there you go. That doesn't look too bad. This one's going to have to be redone. So now there's a little bit of resolene on there at this point. Just a little bit. Except in the areas where I put a bit of ethyl alcohol. And that's what you're going to do to start. You're going to have to do real light coats and try not to pull up too much of the dye or the ink until there's enough resolene on there to protect it. So I'm going to dab a little bit of resolene into these areas where it pulled up, where I had to use the ethyl alcohol. Make sure that there's a nice little coating of it there. Okay. Still need to fix this one here. There's a little bit of smudge there. Sadly, I wish I had a better process for this, but I don't. I'm going to try to pick up that little bit of smudge that came up. As I said before, I'm not sure why, but the ink from that pen, it seems to do a little bit better than the dye. That ink stuck in those letters a lot better than the dye did. I can't tell you why that is. Now, if you need to know what to use to do this with, ethyl alcohol is your best option. Methanol is a little bit toxic. You want to avoid it. So if you don't want to pay a ton of money by buying it from a place like Angelus or Fevings, you can just go and get a bottle of denatured alcohol. Denatured alcohol is basically ethyl alcohol with a bitterant added to it. Okay, since I've done a nice light coat of this, I'm going to let it dry for a little while, and I'm going to come back and try to put on another coat, lightly. And I'll do this 2 or 3 times until there's enough on there that it'll hold. And where this is concerned, this has to be redone, because you can see those letters need to be refilled in, and apparently dye is not going to do it. So I'm going to use this pen, the Uniball 207, to touch up the letters that I was going to use for the dye. This one's looking okay. Obviously I didn't do the best job on the letters and what have you, but this gives you at least the process. The one I actually ended up using turned out a lot better, as you can see. This is the one I ended up using for it. Let me give you the full view of it. And I used this process to make it. I mean, I spent my time doing the letters right, taking the time to do the lines right, being very careful. It took 7 coats of resolene in order to be able to provide this nice, glossy, almost perfect finish. And you can see the leather grain and all of that beautifully. That's the advantage of dye. You can't do that with paint. Paint is a covering. It doesn't have that opacity, that transparency that allows you to appreciate the grain of the leather. So that's what we're aiming for right there. I would have used that video. The problem was I'm still getting used to this camera and my battery died in the middle of doing the video. So I can't show that video because I don't have it. There you go. I'm having to redo the process painstakingly in order to be able to demonstrate it. So I'll let this dry for an hour or so and come back to it. It won't take long. With that light coating of resolene I put on there, it'll be good to go in about an hour. And then I can try that again, where I can put a coat of resolene down, just sort of let it sit in, and then make corrections as I need to, and do that, you know, about every hour until the stuff doesn't come off of it. Then you can do a nice strong coating on it, let it sit, and you're good to go. Okay? Thank you for watching. Okay, this is the piece that has the lettering in ink from the Signo pen right here. Okay? So we've already established that we've got a light coat of resolene on there at this point. Now I'm going to focus on trying to put a coating of just the letters. And how I do this is I just take my little bit of resolene here. You can see it. I got resolene in a little sample cup, and I actually just dip the resolene into the letter like so. Put a pull of it in just that letter. As you can see, that light coating of resolene helped to keep the letters from getting pulled up, the ink anyway. And I'm going to focus just on doing the lettering right now, getting a nice protective coating in there, like so. So that's looking good. If you get a little bit too much, you can just take another Q-tip and then just draw a little out by just lightly touching it. Just barely touch it, and you'll see it pick up the little bit of extra that you've got in there. A little bit of extra in there. Just lightly touch the letter, and it'll pick up the extra. And got a lot more in the end than I needed. And then what I'll do is I'll literally let this resolene that's just sitting in those letters dry. Since there's a fair amount of resolene in there, that's going to take a while to dry. That's not a light coating. That's a fairly heavy coating of resolene sitting in the valley created by that letter stamp. So I will literally let this dry for a fair amount of time. I'm thinking 6 hours, something like that. Now this I'm going to have to redo, because when I went and did the little sample piece, you can see that little bit of water literally picked up the dye right off the resolene. That dye did not stick inside of that little valley. So I'm going to actually do the touch-up with the Uniball Signo pen, where I'm going to take the pen, looks like this E needs a little bit of touch-up right here. Okay. This L definitely needs some touch-up. This is one of the reasons why I was looking for an alternative to using dye, because when I was doing this process, this dye would not stick to the resolene, which seems odd. That's kind of, what dye is known for, is being able to stick. But as you can see, when I put that little bit of water to it, it came right off. So this is the Uniball Signo pen. It's supposed to have some kind of a super ink in there. I don't know what it's made out of, but I'm going to coat it in there with the letters and let it dry. And I'm going to have to let it dry overnight to really seal it in and make sure it's good. So I'll come back to this when these letters are dry, and I will also come back to this, because now these letters are drying with the resolene inside of the lettering. So we're going to see now if I can. I'm going to take just a foam brush like this. See here, just a foam brush, and I'm going to put some resolene on it, and I'm going to just dab it on there, just like so. Okay? And see how it reacts. Keep a paper towel handy in case it starts to pull up, like it's going to do a little bit with the lines, it looks like. So make sure you got a paper towel handy, because you don't want it to dry on there like that. See, the lines are starting to come up. That's one of the consequences of doing this. So I'm just going to pat it. Pat it. Just creating light layers, trying to keep that from getting pulled up. And if I'm being honest, this is a pain. But the letters appear to be staying. Now these lines are coming up. That dye just does not want to stay on. And these lines were done with dye, not with the ink. So we've got another coat on there, and I'm going to have to take my my ethanol and try to fix the lines here a little bit. I wish I could give you a better process that doesn't have these problems. But if you use the pen, you've got a better chance of it not coming up for some reason. I don't know why. You'd think dye, actual leather dye, would be better suited for this, but in this case it's not. So I've got a little bit of it happening there too. So I'm slowly correcting this line as much as I can. and I'll work in towards the line to try and keep it from getting on the white, because once you get it on the white, you're going to have a hard time getting it off. So that right there is suitable enough to leave it as it is. So we're going to revisit this one now. This other one that I put the ink on. And I hate to say it, you're going to have the same problem here. First I'm going to try to do the lettering, as I did before, and see if this will hold. Just going to put some resolene right into the eye here as a test piece. So far so good. Put a little bit of resolene here with a Q-tip into the R, and it's pulling right up. So I'll just take the other side of the Q-tip and try to draw it up so it doesn't get onto the green. That dye, it literally doesn't want to stay on. It's a leather dye, but it won't stick to resolene very well. See that? I put it a little bit down and it comes right off. So that's what I mean by doing two of them. Is you would hope that by doing two of them that you would have one that works out okay. Too much on there, on that one. Soak it up. So I got a little bit on the R here, as you can see, just a little bit, but the other letters are actually holding up okay. So the next thing I have to see is if I'm going to be able to put a little bit on the line itself. These lines were done with dye. So I'm going to just try to dab it on there and see what we get. Just on the edge. Put it a little bit on there. Get a paper towel. And if it starts to pull up, just immediately put it down and grab it up again. We're just trying to do a light coat of resolene to try and protect that from coming up. And again, I know this is a painstaking process and there's got to be a better way. I just wish I knew one. Okay? So I'm just trying to create a protective coating for the line. In this one I didn't succeed entirely. One side looked a little bit better than the other. See that? Came up. So here's my ethanol to correct that. Like so. Got a little bit right there. So now I've got a little bit of the resolene in these letters and they're drying, and these lines have been picked back up again and straightened out a little bit. Same one with this one. See, the lettering itself didn't get pulled up at all. Once I had that other extra coat into the letters, it locked in the letters. It was just this that came up. So now I've got a little bit of the resolene in these letters, and they're drying, and these lines have been picked back up again and straightened out a little bit. Same one with this one. See, the lettering itself didn't get pulled up at all. Once I had that other extra coat into the letters, it locked in the letters. It was just this that came up. Oh, right. We've let it dry here now. You can see these letters look like there's a nice coat of resolene over them. So now I'm going to try to do a general brushing and see if I have any other problems with it coming off of it. It's possible that I'll have something, just because you can't account for everything, no matter how hard you try. Okay. So far, this one's holding up pretty well. This one has a little bit that got drugged out. You can see a little bit there. Just a little. That's why you want to pat it rather than swipe. Because if you swipe, you run the risk of making it worse. So now we need to get a Q-tip and fix this right here. There we go. I know it doesn't look like it's going to work. I get that. I can't say I blame you for thinking that, if that's the case. But it does eventually lock those letters and all that in and keeps it from pulling it from there. See, this is a good process to know, even though it's kind of a pain, because there will come a time when you're going to want to modify something that has already got an acrylic coating on it, because it is a lot easier to just buy something with a coating already on it than it is to make one from scratch. And knowing how to take something that's coated in acrylic and put a design on it is a valuable skill set. Yeah. The end result here is to try and get enough of this resolene in place that it locks the color in without it drifting like it has in the past. Once you do that, then you'll be able to put one good solid coat over it and you're good. So there we have it. Right now, nothing's leaking out. And I've got a nice coating of, I've got a fair amount of resolene down into the letters. So when it dries, I will have a nice protective coating on all those letters. And this time I didn't have to use any of the ethanol, which is nice. So there we have it. You lift this up so you can see it. And when that dries, that is a little bit more of a solid coat. It should dry a little bit, give a better coating in general over this. And I hate to say it, it takes 6 or 7 coats sometimes. But once you get a nice waterproof coating over all of it, you're good. And this one here, same thing. When that dries, it'll have a nice coating over the letters and the lines that I will then be able to, hopefully, you know you're good when you can put a nice solid coat over it and nothing runs. Well, I'm pretty close to being done with these. I think one more coat should do the trick, but as you can see here, it's taken some doing, but these letters are finally locked in underneath the resolene, so that when I lay a coat of resolene down now, it should stay in place and none of this should peel up. That's what I'm hoping for. Once you can put down a coat of resolene and nothing spreads out, then you're finally good. This one was done with marker, and that is why the lettering is a little bit more bold, but that's also why it was more challenging to work with. The more ink you have in these little letter gullies, as I call them, the more likely it will spread out when you put resolene down on it. This one was done with pen, and that's why the letters are a little bit more pronounced. I know this process seems arduous, but I found it virtually impossible to try and paint letters in with a paintbrush, because these letters are so small. That is only a quarter of an inch. Oh, well, that's what they call it, a quarter of an inch letter. And trying to paint that in with a paintbrush, I've tried and failed miserably. So a pen or dye marker is about the only option I've seen that actually works to get be able to get the detail in that A or these letters without screwing it up. So I'm going to do one more coat of resolene on these and see how it fares. See if it's finally at the position that I want it. And this time I'm just going to use just a cheapy little brush you can buy at Harbor Freight. I'm just going to brush it on real quick. A nice thick coat on there to make sure that it's nice and waterproofed. And so far so good. It looks like everything's holding, and that's what you aim for. So now what I'll do is I'll let this thick coat of resolene dry on this, and these are ready to be used. finally. You will need, actually this one's running a little bit. Sometimes it's going to happen, but even now, this one's still having issues. Where is my... This one's holding firm right here, other than a little bit on these lines. See that? Just a little bit of dark. A little bit more right here. So, it's a process. That's what it boils down to. But rest assured, in my opinion, it's worth doing. Because when it actually finishes, it'll look good. These are areas where I used the ethanol more than likely. That's why some of these little areas here are having a little bit of a problem. Like a little bit here, a little bit there. Whenever you use ethanol in an area to clean up something, you actually strip the protectant. Is the problem. So looks like it's gonna work out this time. There you go. I'll let it dry and call it good. So this was done with the ink pen, and the letters look a lot more crisp than this one, which they look a lot more bold. So that's I think usable. It's not as good as the one that I ended up using. This is the one I ended up going with, right there. I don't think it's as good as this one. This one turned out perfectly. I couldn't have asked for it to be a better job. But you'll have to play with it and try it, and get the technique down the way you think it's the best way to go. I can only show you what I can do and go from there. And I've said it over and over, the reason why you would want to do this is so you can actually darken your lettering, you can use multiple colors of dye, and it gives you a little more flexibility on what you want to do on your actual project. And also waterproofing. So there you go. These pieces are now done and usable. So this is the one I would use if I had to pick between the two. Right there. And even with all those coats of resolene, you can still see the grain pattern in the leather. I mean, that's the beauty of using resolene and dye, is it doesn't take away from the grain. It doesn't take away from, the quality that is the leather. So there you have it. Tune in to the next video where I show how to actually stitch it together like this and put it on the actual piece.